Old school B&M. Does it, actually exist? And what does it even mean? It's an oft-repeated phrase reverberating from all corners of the coaster industry, running the full gamut from young adrenaline junkie thrill seekers to older acers who cannot help but opine, "Things used to be better in the old days when B&Ms really packed a punch," pointing to rides like Kumba, Raptor, or Batman the Ride. Newer installations like Banshee or Wing Coasters get ripped to shreds in the comparison, and I won't lie, I was one of those voices. On the face of it though, I think it's a real thing. My personal experience tells me that B&M has really changed. A Bat clone certainly feels a good bit whippier than a newer invert like Banshee, but this was the type of question that my engineer brain couldn't help but to just latch on, and it's been stewing in my head ever since, growing louder and louder. Is old school B&M really real? Or is it just a placebo effect that we enthusiasts have deluded ourselves into thinking is the truth? I couldn't just let it sit in my head anymore, I had to find out myself. It's time to investigate the existence of old school B&M. Before we begin, however, troubling news. My reliable sources have successfully uncovered the financial transactions of Alan Schilke, founding member of the recently revived DIN Corporation, and discovered the suspicious purchase of a 1981 DeLorean. This purchase seems to have come shortly after a recent trip to Universal Studios Orlando, where Schilke stood outside of the Simpsons ride taking notes while wearing those silly glasses worn by Dr. Emmett Brown in the year 2015. Please like and subscribe to the channel so I will have enough of a platform to contact famous time crime investigator Biff Tannen, and hopefully put a stop to this potentially dangerous development. Thank you. Alright, now, a little context. Bolliger & Mabillard, commonly known as B&M, has been making roller coasters since their founding in 1988. Their first coaster, Firebird, opened up in 1990 as a lowly stand-up with a mere 2 inversions, but from there B&M rapidly expanded, pioneering the modern invert with Batman the Ride in 1992, taking their looper model to the next level with 1993's Kumba, and branching out in all different directions from there. B&Ms were, and continue to be, absolutely massive hits. The GP gobble up the imposing dive and graceful wing coasters. Enthusiasts love their intense inverts and glass-smooth hypers chock full of solid floater airtime. Parks and maintenance crews love their reliability, and the company has made such robust rides that only 3 of their 124 installations have ever met their demise. Which means that almost every single one of their earliest products is still around. Kumba, their earliest big looper, is still very much kicking it despite the near monthly panic from Thoosies. At least 11 parks still have a Batman the Ride clone dating all the way back to 1992. And the vast majority of 90s B&M's most ambitious installations like Dragon Con, Alpengeist, Riddler's Revenge, or The Incredible Hulk continue to march on exactly the same as they were 30 years ago. Well, not exactly for the Hulk, but we'll get to that later. In the modern day, B&M has continued to dominate, branching out further with newer models such as the Flyer or the Surf Coaster. Still, even with the glut of orders for family inverts and shuttle wing coasters, B&M isn't afraid to occasionally dip back into the toolbox and pull out a classic looper. Oziris, Decepticoaster, Monster, Banshee, B&M is still very much dishing out their old bread and butter. But some thoosies at the mention of a new B&M looper will lament the loss of something intangible. They will look back on the old days with a fervor that can only be matched by the mom from Bowling for Soup's 1985. Man, B&M was so much better back in the day. I'm here to find out. Was it? I mean, has anything even really changed? There's one very obvious major shift that happened in the past decade or so, which is the introduction of vests on B&M dives and loopers, but B&M is far from the only company to make this change. Pretty much everyone in the industry has. Besides, we're not here to argue about restraints, I've already done that. Maybe we can look at the oh-too brief moment in the late 2000s where B&M decided to outfit their hypers with longboy trains, but that was basically a fluke. A little experiment that lasted a couple years at most, the Dio era of B&M's discography. And even though Dio's the better singer, eventually they went back to Ozzy. But ignoring this one outlier and putting aside the physical restraints themselves, the trains are basically the same as they were in the 90s. The track is the same, the models are the same, there isn't much to glean here from a visual inspection. If we want to prove the existence of old school B&M, we have to move beyond what we can see with the naked eye. The real question is this: are the forces on old school B&Ms actually different? And that's what we're going to have to wrestle with today, and it's going to require a bit of work to get there. First, we need to define what old school B&M really is, and that's a bit tougher than I initially envisioned. And generally, enthusiasts tend to say that old school B&Ms are a lot whippier, while more modern installations focus on float. And that's a nice, simple description, but it's not exactly specific. Beyond that vague definition, there's another complicating factor. There isn't really an agreed-upon cutoff point where B&M changed their design philosophy overnight. It happened gradually, and not exactly linearly. And take Talon at Dorney Park, made in 2001, and Silver Bullet at Knott's Berry Farm, made 3 full years later. If I didn't know when each ride was made, and I had to guess which one was newer after riding them back to back, I would guess Talon, and I would be wrong. So if we want to make a definition of old school that holds up to scrutiny, it's essential to make strongly defined sample populations. Pick examples that will leave no room for doubt. Let's begin there then, starting with the ride model. Here we can immediately and thankfully throw a bunch of models away. The wing and flyer models didn't exist in the early days of the company, and the only dive machine from the previous millennium, Oblivion, is so short that it would be useless for any comparison. That leaves their loopers, inverts, and hypers, but I'm going to throw out the hypers here as well. While an argument can be made that B&M hypers feel markedly different now, the company's hypercoasters have always been on the milder side compared to their loopers, focusing on floater airtime and graceful transitions over whippy elements, and that doesn't make for a very strong comparison when the whippiness is what we're looking at in the first place. So say goodbye to your local B&M hyper. That leaves us with the loopers, and we have plenty of examples to choose from, both old and new, above the track and under the track. Thank God, once again we have an exact clone scenario with the legendary Incredible Hulk at Islands of Adventure, cloned in 2021 at Universal Studios Beijing to create the Decepticoaster. So let's add those guys to the pile right away. And I personally think that the best examples of old school B&M rest under the track. The inverts, the kings of tight and forceful elements. There's a B&M invert in the United States that many consider to be an exemplar of the new school B&M design philosophy, and that's Banshee at Kings Island, opening a good 22 years after the original Batman the Ride. Now that time gap is more than enough to ensure that no one will argue with me in the comments, so let's throw that in the new school pile with Decepticoaster. Other easy examples include 2012's Oziris at Parc Asterie, and B&M's newest invert installation, the Monster at Groneland. As for the old school crowd, I'm going to take the old school thing very literally and give myself a strong year cutoff. I will not be considering any B&M made in this millennium for the old school pool, so that's nothing after 1999. Simple enough, that's a nice 15-year gap between the old school and Banshee, and it just slots in the Hulk as well. Yes, the Hulk has been retracked, but that is an easy problem to solve. We will limit ourselves to POVs recorded before the retrack. We have our examples, but now we need to come up with some way to quantify their differences. Some objective relation we can directly point to and say, hey, the math don't lie. Thankfully, our answer is staring at us right in the face. We're gonna look at whip. It's time to give a spotlight to the red-headed stepchild of classical mechanics, whip, aka jerk. I'm not calling you a jerk, by the way, that's its actual scientific name, jerk. And if you want a bit of a laugh, the further derivatives of time are called snap, crackle, and pop respectively. No, I am not joking, look it up. Jerk is the third derivative of position, or distance with respect to time. Okay, I just saw a bunch of eyes glaze over at the mere mention of calculus, so let me break it down. Position, speed, and acceleration are all linked together. For example, we're all aware the amount of time it takes to travel a certain distance is known as your speed or velocity. Like if you hop in your car to travel 60 miles and drive at a constant 60 miles an hour, you will get to your destination in 1 hour. That is all we're talking about here. Velocity is distance over time, or the time derivative of distance. Likewise, acceleration is the time derivative of velocity. When thoozies rave about the incredible launch on a ride like King Dakar, you'll inevitably hear a stat like 0 to 128 miles an hour in 3.5 seconds. Or maybe you're watching a car review and you hear this soothing voice of John Davis say,
0 to 60 took 8.3 seconds.
As you can see, we're doing the same thing we did for distance, just with velocity. 128 miles an hour in 3.5 seconds, That's just dividing the velocity by the time, and we can get an average acceleration of about 16 meters per second squared. Now that might be a tad abstract if you're not an engineer, but I hope you get the idea. And that brings us to jerk, which is even more abstract than acceleration because it isn't really something we often use in our everyday lives. It basically boils down to how fast you accelerate, which seems like a bit of an oxymoron, so let's look at another example, a standing LSM launch. With most LSM launches, you feel a good initial yank when the launch first hits, and then the pull feels a bit weaker for the rest of the launch. And this is a pretty good example of what jerk feels like. There's a lot of inertia to overcome at a standstill, so the initial shove feels a lot stronger as the LSM's push to get to its desired acceleration. But then the acceleration becomes steady, and even though you're constantly accelerating down the launch track, it doesn't really feel like that gut punch you get at the beginning. When we feel the kick of a launch, what we're actually feeling is not the acceleration but the jerk. When the jerk disappears, the sensation of acceleration fades a bit with it, and that's what we're talking about here. Or take the classic arrow transition. Yep, we can prove with science that arrow transitions are indeed jerky, because you go from a constant radius to another constant radius, or a piece of straight track without any lead-in. If we go back to our Magnum versus Steel Force video and look at the Triangle Hill force diagram, see how quickly the force changes from almost nothing to crazy ejector? That causes a huge amount of jerk. And that's the reason why Magnum gives such a gut punch and why an ejector hill on an RMC, for example, feels nothing like it. Okay, well that was a bit of a tangent, but I hope I've described jerk effectively enough. Basically, jerk is whip, and if we want to really prove that old school B&Ms are more whippy, we need to prove that they exhibit more jerk. How can we do that? With math, of course, but I've had to get a little creative. The best way to do this would be to measure the forces directly, as force and acceleration are directly proportional. But I have some bad news for you random thoosie who track the forces on an invert with their phone. Your iPhone 6 with a broken screen banging around in your pocket is not giving us a reliable reading. Sorry to disappoint. We can, however, derive what we need from nice, objective ride POVs, and we have a perfect element to use for our calculation, the 0G roll, a common element found on almost every single B&M looper. The 0G roll is a good place to start because it basically rotates around itself in a straight line. It's a simple 360 degrees of rotational acceleration without too much else going on. If we can find two rides with a similar velocity, which would allow us to isolate the track profile as the sole contributor, we can compare their 0G rolls one-on-one and find out which one experiences more angular acceleration. The velocity thing is important to note though. Of course, the JoJo roll on Hydra is less whippy than the death roll on Kumba, that has way more to do with the speed of the train than the track profile. I talked about this in more detail in my heartlining video, but here's a quick refresher on angular acceleration. When you're rotating around the center of a circular path, kind of like what you do in a 0G roll, the train, and thus the riders, will experience an acceleration that tries to fling you out of your seat, equal to v squared over r. And if you want to calculate that angular acceleration from rotation, it's even simpler. A equals delta omega, or the amount of rotation, over delta t, the change in time. With this equation, we can calculate the time to rotate through a full 0G roll, or 360 degrees, and get an angular acceleration. And since the angular acceleration of the train is 0 right before the roll, we can use this calculated angular acceleration to determine an average jerk, as it would be reasonable to assume the angular acceleration at the center of the 0G roll is at its maximum, and the time taken to reach this acceleration will simply be half the time to complete the roll in its entirety. Okay, I went a little off the wall there. Let's distill this mathematical mumbo-jumbo down to a basic conclusion. Here's what you need to know. If an old school B&M is actually whippier, we would expect it to rotate through the 0G roll more quickly. I know that's kind of a bit of a duh statement, but now we have the math to actually back it up. Jerk is acceleration over time. The train needs to accelerate around 360 degrees in a 0G roll, so less time means more jerk. That's pretty straightforward, right? And the gods have answered my prayers once again as we have a perfect clone comparison with the Hulk and Decepticoaster. Let's look at the 0G roll right from the end of the launch tunnel and see how they unfold. Immediately, the Hulk looks like it twists far more quickly, but that could just be 10 years of better camera tech playing tricks on our eyes. So let's slow it down now, and this time I'll actually time it. The Hulk is done rotating after about 1.8 seconds. Meanwhile, the Decepticoaster doesn't fully uncoil until about 3.5 seconds have passed, which is a pretty huge difference. And the slowed down POV showcases an interesting thing on the Hulk you don't see in the Decepticoaster. Much further up the drop, the 0G roll on the Hulk just kinda stops, even though the track isn't completely straightened out. It almost banks a bit in the other direction before heading down to the bottom of the drop. The Decepticoaster, in contrast, takes nearly the entire drop to uncoil from the roll, which is a big difference in profiling. For some objective numbers, the Hulk's 0G roll accelerates at about half a reciprocal second squared, while the Decepticoaster's roll averages a much slower 0.285 reciprocal seconds squared. These are average values, I know, and I am aware the rotation does slow down the Decepticoaster as it approaches the ground, but it's what we've got for our first example. We have more. Let's go to the Invert model and compare two inverts of similar stature. The 105-foot-tall Batman the Ride versus the 111-foot-tall monster at Groenland. Both have pretty similar stats, and we can probably assume that they entered their 0G rolls at similar speeds, so let's give it a look. Jesus. Yeah, that's almost impossible to compare. The roll on Monster is so much slower. I'll be thorough though and take out the timer. The Batman takes about 2.5 seconds to whip through its roll, while Monster takes 3.25 seconds in comparison to roll through the element. That's 0.4 reciprocal seconds squared versus 0.31 reciprocal seconds squared, over a 30% difference. I mean, it's a pretty open and shut case here, right? Now compare Monster's roll to Banshee, another new school invert. They're both very similar in that they rotate very gently, slow to a near crawl at the top, and start rotating super early in the element. The trend aligns. Honestly, we can spot this dramatic difference pretty easily with the picture comparison. I mean, just look how much earlier the rotation begins on Banshee when compared to, say, Montu, Alpengeist, the Great Bear. I rest my case. Rather, I should rest my case. We could just end it here, but one more thing bothered me. The profiling between the two is a lot different, but so is the speed with the dramatic rise in newer inverts. If an older invert went up into the air as high as Banshee or Monster did in its 0G roll, it might feel just as floaty. So can I find an old school, new school comparison where the two trains travel at nearly the same speed throughout the whole element? That would give us a smoking gun. Irrefutable proof that not just the element design, but the track profile itself has changed. So I searched, and searched, and searched some more, pouring through invert POVs, and the main conclusion that I came home with is that old school inverts take their 0G rolls much faster than the newer rides. But I was able to find at least one decent set for comparison. Nemesis, the classic small but mighty invert at Alton Towers, versus Oziris at Parc Asterie, a late model invert from 2012 that doesn't quite reach the dramatic rise of its more modern brethren with its own 0G roll. After poring over POVs, this was the closest speed match I could find, and it's decently close enough. Take a look for yourself. Within the margin of error, I'd say. Let's watch the comparison more slowly and see what we find. Even with Oziris rotating much faster than Monster or Banshee, Nemesis seems to start later and end sooner. The timing confirms my suspicions. Nemesis's roll clocks in at a swift 2.1 seconds, while Oziris's roll takes around 2.8 seconds, for a respective angular acceleration of 0.48 reciprocal seconds squared and 0.36 reciprocal seconds squared. I also took the liberty of measuring the distance covered by the roll with track ties, from the top of the roll, the point of theoretical maximum acceleration, to the moment it stops rotating. After all, velocity is distance over time, and since we assumed equivalent velocities, that should mean a shorter distance means a shorter time. This analysis backed up my stopwatch results. Nemesis dispatches the second half of its 0G roll in 11 track ties, while Oziris needs 14. The B&M track ties are about a meter apart, according to this definitely legitimate dude on a random coaster forum, which means that Nemesis takes 11 meters of track to rotate 180 degrees, while Oziris takes 14. That's a pretty significant 27% difference. With this method, I was also able to measure the speed of the train at the top of the 0G roll to ensure that the speed was actually consistent. Nemesis clocked in at an admittedly imprecise 11 meters per second, while Oziris clocked in at 9.4 meters per second. God damn it! Listen, I know they're not perfect comparisons, I tried my best, but we can normalize this, thankfully. If we speed up Oziris a bit to match the calculated velocity for Nemesis, Nemesis still rotates faster, 0.48 reciprocal seconds squared versus 0.42 reciprocal seconds squared for speedy Oziris. And if anything, the additional speed that Nemesis carries supports the old school B&M theory even further. Even a fast, new school 0G roll is longer than one on a 43-foot tall invert from 1994, and the 43-foot tall invert dispatches the element more quickly. It's not the perfect invert one-to-one that I was looking for, but it'll do. Now, I've just spent a lot of time on 0G rolls, and I feel like I've proven my point, but what about other elements? Unfortunately, the math is a lot less straightforward, but we can make qualitative comparisons all day, as the same principle applies to elements like the famed snappy B&M Cobra roll. If old school B&M is truly real, then we would expect the directional change to happen far more quickly in the older rides. And if we return to our Hulk Decepticoaster comparison, we can see that the old school theory is confirmed yet again. Notice how the Hulk track snaps to vertical right where the corkscrew joins the half loop, while the Decepticoaster continues to rotate further down. Banshee shows a similar behavior in its dive loop. Notice how at maximum height the track is still very much banked? Compare that to the dive loop on Kraken, which aggressively snaps to 180 degrees at the top of its loop. These additional examples provide more evidence to show that B&M very much did change the track profiling. To add some more evidence to the pile, there are some less cut and dry elements we could look at too. The first drops on newer inverts have changed pretty dramatically, even ignoring the loss of the pre-drop. And notice the profiling on Raptor halfway down its first drop, where it quickly snaps back to zero banking like a roller coaster tycoon ride. Compare that to Banshee, where the change in banking is almost imperceptible. One of my favorite examples of this is the hilariously tight transition into the corkscrew on the Hulk, which is dispatched with far more grace by its younger brother. These little profiling quirks lead to jerky accelerations that impart forces on the rider, and some people aren't a fan of getting janked around, but I love it. It gives the ride some character. It's how you get airtime on Raptor's first drop, or the savagery of Montu's double pull into the Batwing. Banshee's got nothing like that, even if the first drop is profiled for better airtime. Alright, now I think that's enough evidence to rest my case. Our mathematical exploration has proven that old school B&M really is a thing. Now whenever you go to Kings Island and bitch about Banshee, you can tell your friends that a qualified engineer confirmed your biases. Congratulations. But this leaves us with one final question. Why? B&M didn't need to do this. Old B&Ms are still often the most popular rides at their respective parks. Obviously there's more to this change than just business. I think there are three main contributors here. The first is that tastes in the amusement industry have changed. I talked about this a lot in my i305 elegy. There's a big focus on intensity from the early days of the steel coaster that peaked kind of around the 2010s, when the few rides just took it a little bit too far. With the failure of massive investments like i305 and Skyrush, manufacturers realized that most parkgoers don't actually want face-melting whippy intensity the whole ride. They want a comfortable coaster that can be intense but doesn't throw you around that much. And sure, you could point to RMC as a counterexample. They've painted over their fair share of old woodies with a fresh coat of jerky pre-lifts and ejector airtime, but even they're dialing things back lately. Compare the savagery of Railblazer to the relative calm of Jersey Devil or even Stunt Pilot. A change in philosophy has definitely taken place. The second contributor is that most parks that would potentially benefit from a whippy B&M already have a whippy B&M. When you already have a Kumba and a Montu, it doesn't make much sense to turn Sheikra into a whippy ride, does it? Most of the Six Flags parks still have their insanely intense bat clones. Cedar Point already has Raptor. It makes total sense that they would go graceful with Gatekeeper and Valraven. And even outside of American coaster chains, this is the case. And Parc Asteri already had Guderi trying to rip your face off, and Grunneland has an intimate Zaxpin, need I say more? But the last point, which is my own little pet theory, is that this is what B&M has always wanted. Look at the early inverts. Some of the most famously whippy elements are mistakes, manufacturing limitations from 3 decades ago. While old school B&Ms are still generally smooth and enthusiasts like us love to claim they are virtually free of headbanging, virtually does not mean entirely. These rides do headbang specifically in their most powerful moments. And if you want to make the smoothest ride experience, you're going to need to change the profiling. You're going to have to dial those transitions back, and when you do that, the whip kind of disappears. To me, it's honestly a bit sad that the newest inverts and loopers are missing the bite of B&M's earliest creations. It's especially sad as we watch more and more Arrows and Schwarzkopfs fade into the ether, taking their imperfections and their unintentional resultant intensity with them. But at the end of the day, I'm not losing too much sleep over it, because old school B&Ms are still everywhere. And as some of their oldest creations get full retracts with their old school profiling intact, we can rest assured that the old school experience will be with us for decades to come. Well folks, I did it again. I made an overly long crash course video that is 1,000 words over where I wanted the script to be, but hope you enjoyed me counting out track ties. Anyways, thank you though for really listening. This is another higher effort video and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy this, go watch some of my other Crash Course videos. The last Crash Course video did really well, but look at some of my older videos, about the back row. about heartlining, that sort of thing. I'd also definitely recommend looking at some of my elegy videos. Those are kind of my other big effort videos beyond this. And of course, I have my little memes, my tier list, all that other fun stuff. Maybe be starting live streams again soon, so if you want to check that out, let me know. Please give this video a like if you haven't already. Please subscribe to the channel. Every sub definitely helps. And as always, thank you for watching.